Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus and then disappeared. All 4 Gospels preserve his name and what he did that Friday, yet none of them tells us how his story ended. Centuries later, that silence would be filled with stories of imprisonment, a miraculous escape, a journey to Britain, and even the Holy Grail. But there is a problem. The more detailed Joseph's story becomes, the farther removed it is from the actual events. So where does the man preserved in the Gospels end and the legend begin? And after the stone sealed the tomb of Jesus, what really happened to Joseph of Arimathea? When we look closely at the New Testament accounts, few figures inspire as much curiosity, while leaving behind such a remarkable gap as Joseph of Arimathea. His name appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All 4 Gospels preserve his role at a decisive moment. After Jesus died, Joseph approached Pilate, asked for the body, and took part in the burial. For a man who occupies so little space in the narrative, his presence at that moment is remarkably consistent across the Gospel accounts. And that matters because crucifixion did not simply end when the condemned person died. What happened to the body afterward depended on the circumstances, local practices, and the decision of the authorities. In some Roman contexts, the bodies of the crucified could remain exposed. In others, burial was possible when the official in charge authorized the body's release. In the case of Jesus, the Gospels record precisely such an authorization. Joseph went to Pilate and asked for the body. Mark adds that Pilate first confirmed Jesus' death with the centurion before granting Joseph's request. There was also a very real sense of urgency. The Sabbath was approaching, and the burial had to be completed before sundown. At that point, Joseph stops being merely a name associated with the Jewish leadership and becomes an active participant in the events. John brings Nicodemus into the burial preparations. The body is wrapped in linen with spices and placed inside a new tomb. Matthew identifies that tomb directly with Joseph. Once the stone closes the entrance, Joseph's role in the Gospel accounts appears to be finished. And then something curious happens. Joseph virtually disappears. The Book of Acts follows the expansion of the early Christian community, recording conflicts in Jerusalem, arrests, persecution, missionary journeys, and the emergence of new leaders. Paul names numerous associates and members of the earliest Christian communities, yet none of these writings gives us a reliable continuation of Joseph of Arimathea's story. After the burial, the canonical sources do not tell us where he lived, whether he remained in Jerusalem, whether he suffered any consequences for what he had done, how long he lived, or where he died. That silence eventually produced exactly what major historical gaps so often produce: stories created to fill them. Centuries later, non-canonical Christian writings began adding new episodes to Joseph's life. One tradition claimed that the authorities imprisoned him after he buried Jesus. Much later, during the Middle Ages, his story would cross boundaries the Gospels never mention. Joseph would become associated with Britain, with Glastonbury, and eventually with one of the most famous sacred objects in medieval legend, the Holy Grail. The challenge is separating those layers. There is the Joseph preserved in the 4 Gospels, then there are the apocryphal accounts that appeared later, and farther removed still are the medieval traditions developed many centuries after Joseph would have lived. That distinction is exactly what matters here. Not because the legends should simply be discarded, they tell a fascinating story about how Joseph was remembered, but because we need to determine how far the surviving evidence actually allows us to go. Who was the man who stepped forward when Jesus needed to be buried? What can his position in Jerusalem really tell us? And most importantly, is there any reliable evidence for what happened to Joseph of Arimathea after that weekend? To answer that, we have to return to the Friday of the crucifixion and meet the man whom John describes as a secret disciple of Jesus until the moment when remaining hidden was no longer an option. To understand why Joseph of Arimathea stands out so sharply in the crucifixion accounts, we first have to move beyond a simplified picture of Jesus' followers. Not all of them belong to the circle of fishermen and Galileans who followed him openly. Joseph appears in a very different social position. Matthew describes him as a rich man. Mark presents him as a respected member of the council, someone who was also waiting for the kingdom of God. Luke adds that he was a good and righteous man who had not agreed with the decision and actions of the others. John, meanwhile, gives us the detail that makes Joseph's presence at this moment even more intriguing. He was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish authorities. Even Joseph's place of origin remains somewhat uncertain. The Gospels identify him as Joseph of Arimathea, but the exact location of that town cannot be established with complete confidence. Different sites have been proposed over time, often connecting the name with the region of Ramathaim, but the evidence is not strong enough to turn any of those identifications into certainty. For our investigation, however, the crucial question is not where Joseph was born. It is the position he occupied when Jesus died. Mark uses language that places Joseph among the prominent members of the Jewish council. Traditionally, this reference has been associated with the Sanhedrin, an institution that exercised religious and judicial authority in Jerusalem under Roman rule. That position makes Joseph's portrayal in the Gospels even more unusual. Jesus had come into conflict with important religious authorities in Jerusalem, yet Joseph appears as someone situated within that very environment, while also being sympathetic to Jesus. Luke sharpens that tension by saying that Joseph had not consented to the decision and actions of the others. The text does not explain exactly how his disagreement played out, but it reveals something important. The council should not be treated as though every member necessarily thought and acted in exactly the same way. The precise composition of the council, how it functioned, and the limits of its authority in the first century remain matters of historical discussion. So it would be misleading to picture Joseph simply as the ancient equivalent of a modern senator, or to give him powers the Gospels never describe. What we can say is that he was not presented as an insignificant man. Joseph had enough standing, resources and access to approach the Roman governor and request the body of a man who had been executed by crucifixion. Matthew reinforces Joseph's economic status by calling him wealthy and associating him with the new tomb in which Jesus would be placed. Rock-cut tombs were part of known burial practices in Judea during this period, particularly among families with means. That fits Matthew's description, but it does not allow us to calculate Joseph's fortune or turn him, as some modern retellings do, into the ancient equivalent of a millionaire or billionaire. The Gospels simply do not give us that kind of information. But there is an even more important tension in his story. If Joseph belonged to the council, what was his relationship to the decision that led to Jesus' death? Luke gives us the essential clue when he says Joseph had not agreed with the decision and actions of the others. The text preserves his dissent, but it does not tell us exactly what form that dissent took. We do not know whether Joseph was present at every stage of the proceedings, whether he spoke in Jesus' defence, whether there was a formal vote in which he participated, or what consequences, if any, he faced for disagreeing. Any detailed reconstruction of those hours would go beyond what Luke actually tells us. John adds another dimension. Joseph was a disciple, but secretly for fear of the Jews. Language that, within the context of John's Gospel, should be understood in relation to the authorities and groups opposing Jesus, rather than as an indiscriminate reference to the Jewish people as a whole. The detail tells us that Joseph had reasons to fear being publicly associated with Jesus. John itself contains other episodes in which people hesitate to express support openly because they fear social or religious consequences. We do not need to invent exactly what Joseph stood to lose in order to understand the tension. The text already tells us that the fear was real and that it had been enough to keep his discipleship hidden, and that is precisely why his appearance after the crucifixion matters so much. Joseph does not reveal himself when Jesus enters Jerusalem before a crowd. He does not step forward publicly when Jesus' signs are drawing attention. The Gospels bring his secret discipleship into the open only after Jesus is already dead. From a human perspective, this seems like the least advantageous moment to abandon anonymity. The execution was over. The charge displayed on the cross identified Jesus as King of the Jews. His followers had scattered, and the Sabbath was rapidly approaching. Yet Joseph makes a decision that makes remaining completely hidden impossible. He goes to Pilate and asks for the body. Mark describes that change with particularly striking language, saying that Joseph took courage and went in before Pilate. That may be one of the most revealing details we possess about him. We do not know everything that was at stake. We do not know whether he lost his position, his property, or any privilege because of what he did. But we do know that a man previously described as a secret disciple chose to act publicly at a moment when Jesus could seemingly offer him no political or social advantage. The death of Jesus had placed Joseph before a concrete choice. If no one intervened, he would have no control over what happened to the body, and according to the Gospels, this was the moment when the man who had remained in the shadows finally stepped forward. The Sabbath was approaching. The time available for burial was running out. Joseph now had to turn his decision into action and do something none of Jesus' better-known disciples is described as doing at that moment: present himself before the Roman authority and ask for the body of Jesus to be released to him. Time was running out to bury Jesus. According to the Gospels, it was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath would begin at sundown. John connects this urgency with the need to remove the bodies from the crosses, while Jewish law itself required that the body of someone who had been hanged not remain exposed overnight. Joseph of Arimathea had to act quickly, but there was a fundamental obstacle. The body remained under Roman authority, and Pilate had to authorize its release. Mark tells us that Joseph took courage, went before the governor, and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead and summoned the centurion to confirm it. Only after receiving that confirmation did he grant Joseph the body. John preserves another detail from those final moments. When the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. Because of this, they did not break his legs as they had done to the others who were crucified, although one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. Mark and John are describing distinct episodes, but both converge on an important point in the sequence leading to the burial. Jesus was already dead when his body was taken down from the cross. With Pilate's permission secured, Joseph could finally proceed with the burial. And John introduces another figure into the story, Nicodemus, the man who had previously come to Jesus at night. According to the Gospel, he brought a large quantity of myrrh and aloes, described by John as about 100 litre. Joseph and Nicodemus then wrapped the body of Jesus in linen cloths with the spices, in keeping with the Jewish burial custom described in the text. The approaching Sabbath continued to shape every decision. John tells us that near the place of crucifixion there was a garden, and in that garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because the tomb was nearby and the day of preparation was drawing to a close, Jesus was placed there. Matthew identifies it as Joseph's own new tomb, cut out of the rock. Mark and Luke also describe a rock-cut tomb, and Luke adds that no one had ever been buried there before. The details differ slightly from one account to another, but all four Gospels converge on the central event. Joseph of Arimathea received the body of Jesus and took a direct role in his burial. The women who had followed Jesus also appear at this point in the story. Mark records that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watched where the body was laid. Luke likewise says that the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body had been placed there. That detail creates an important connection with the first day of the week. Within the Gospel narratives themselves, the women who would later return to the tomb had already seen where Jesus had been buried. When everything was finished, a stone was rolled against the entrance. The Sabbath was beginning. Joseph had asked Pilate for the body, taken part in the burial preparations, and placed Jesus in the tomb. His role that Friday was nearly complete. The Gospels would now move toward the women, the first day of the week, and the discovery of the empty tomb. Joseph, however, was about to disappear from the narrative, and this is where the real mystery of his story begins. We know what Joseph did that Friday. What the canonical sources do not tell us is what happened to Joseph of Arimathea afterward. The burial ends, the stone seals the entrance to the tomb, and from that point forward, something remarkable happens to Joseph of Arimathea. He virtually disappears from the canonical record. The Gospels move on to the first day of the week, the discovery of the empty tomb, and the accounts of the risen Jesus. Then the book of Acts follows the growth of the Christian community in Jerusalem, the preaching of the apostles, conflicts with the authorities, arrests, persecution, and eventually the movement's expansion beyond Judea. But Joseph never returns to an identifiable place in that story. We do not know where he was when the first proclamations of the resurrection began. We do not know whether he remained in Jerusalem, continued as a member of the council, began openly professing his faith, or suffered any consequences for requesting and burying the body of Jesus. The text simply does not tell us, and that silence has to be taken seriously. Acts preserves the names of many people connected with the early church, but it was never intended to provide a biography of every person who appears in the Gospels. Joseph's absence, therefore, does not prove that something dramatic happened to him. It tells us only that his later story was not preserved there. The same is true of the New Testament letters. Paul names numerous co-workers, leaders, and members of early Christian communities, but Joseph of Arimathea does not appear among them. That does not prove that Joseph was dead. exiled, imprisoned, or separated from the Christian community. It simply means that these writings do not provide us with an identifiable continuation of his life. That distinction is crucial, because this is exactly where curiosity can begin moving faster than the evidence. We know a considerable amount about a few hours of Joseph's life. Matthew describes him as wealthy and as a disciple of Jesus. Mark presents him as a respected member of the council who was waiting for the kingdom of God and who took courage to approach Pilate. Luke describes him as good and righteous and says he had not consented to the decision and actions of the others. John calls him a secret disciple and places Nicodemus alongside him in the preparation of Jesus' body. But after the burial, the documentary trail ends. There is no canonical account saying Joseph was expelled from the council. There is no passage stating that he lost his wealth. There is no reliable canonical record that he was imprisoned for burying Jesus, and no secure information about when, where, or how he died. Nor do we know whether he left Jerusalem during the persecutions later described in Acts. Some of those possibilities may sound plausible when we try to reconstruct the religious and political tensions of the period. But plausibility is not evidence, and that distinction is essential if we want to answer the question at the heart of this investigation without turning speculation into history. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of investigation, where we separate what the text actually says from what was added over the centuries, subscribe to the channel so you can follow the next documentaries as well, and tell me in the comments what city, state, or country you're watching from, because it's always fascinating to see how far these biblical investigations are reaching. Joseph's silence also tells us something important about the way the New Testament writings work. They are not modern biographies designed to follow every character into old age and record how each person died. People enter and leave the narrative according to their role in the events the authors are preserving. Even significant figures can disappear without explanation. In Joseph's case, what the Gospels considered essential to preserve was his role in the burial. What happened to him afterwards simply does not become part of the canonical story that has come down to us. But for later generations of Christians, that absence became increasingly difficult to ignore. How could a man who had appeared at such a decisive moment simply vanish without anyone knowing what became of him? The question was almost inevitable, and when the earliest texts offer no answer, later traditions often begin filling the empty space. Gradually, the silence acquired a story. Joseph would be imprisoned. He would be persecuted. He would be miraculously freed. Much later, he would cross continents, reach Britain, and eventually become associated with the Holy Grail. Some of these traditions appeared centuries after the Gospels. Others would take nearly 1,000 years to develop into the forms that later became famous. That is why Joseph's disappearance from the canonical record does not end our investigation. It opens the most surprising part of it, because now we leave behind what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually preserved and enter an entirely different territory, the stories later generations told to explain what the earlier sources never did. When the canonical texts leave Joseph of Arimathea behind, a second story begins. No longer the story recorded in the Gospels, but the one later generations began to tell. And the farther we move from the first century, the more extraordinary Joseph's fate becomes. One important source in that transformation is the Gospel of Nicodemus, which incorporates a work known as the Acts of Pilate. This material survives in forms much later than the canonical Gospels, and offers a continuation that those earlier texts never provide. In this account, Joseph faces the anger of the authorities after the burial, is imprisoned, and placed under guard. The story then takes a miraculous turn. Joseph disappears from the prison, and later recounts that the risen Jesus appeared to him and set him free. The story shows that Christians in later centuries were already trying to answer the same question that still surrounds Joseph today. What happened to him after the burial? But we have no contemporary evidence that allows us to treat his imprisonment and miraculous release as established events in his life. Centuries later, Joseph would enter an even more famous tradition. Near the end of the 12th century, the French poet Robert de Boron wrote Joseph of Arimathea, a work that connected Joseph with the vessel used at the Last Supper and with the blood of Christ. From this literary development, Joseph became increasingly woven into the tradition surrounding the Holy Grail. The historical distance here is crucial. Robert de Boron was writing more than 1,000 years after Joseph would have lived. The Gospels never say that Joseph possessed the cup from the Last Supper, collected the blood of Jesus in it, or was entrusted with protecting it. That connection belongs to the medieval development of the Grail tradition, and Joseph's story continued to grow. Medieval and later traditions eventually connected him with Britain, especially Glastonbury, portraying him as a figure linked to the beginnings of Christianity there. In later versions, Joseph travelled to the region, established a Christian community, and brought sacred relics with him. Another famous legend claimed that he planted his staff in the ground at Glastonbury, and that it miraculously blossomed, giving rise to the tradition of the Glastonbury thorn. But once again, chronology creates a serious problem. We have no first-century source placing Joseph in Britain, nor any contemporary Christian testimony claiming that he evangelized the region. His connection with Glastonbury appears much later, and eventually became an important part of the religious tradition surrounding the site. When we place these stories in chronological order, the pattern becomes much clearer. The Gospels preserve Joseph at the burial and then fall silent. Later apocryphal texts give him imprisonment and miraculous release. More than 1,000 years later, medieval literature connects him with the Holy Grail, and still other traditions extend his story all the way to Glastonbury. That does not make these stories meaningless. They reveal how the memory of a biblical figure was transformed over the centuries. But there is an essential difference between studying a tradition and using that tradition as biography. And now we can strip those layers away and return to the question that actually matters. Without the miraculous imprisonment story, without the Grail, and without Glastonbury, is there any historical evidence that can tell us what really happened to Joseph of Arimathea after he buried Jesus? After moving through centuries of tradition, we finally arrive at the central question of this investigation. What happened to Joseph of Arimathea after he buried Jesus? Once we remove the later stories and return to the earlier sources, the historical answer is far more limited. We do not know what happened to Joseph after the burial. The Gospels allow us to follow him through that Friday. After that, the documentary trail disappears. There is no canonical text saying that Joseph was expelled from the council, stripped of his wealth, imprisoned, or forced to leave Jerusalem. John tells us that he had previously kept his discipleship secret out of fear, while Mark says that Joseph took courage before approaching Pilate. That tells us his decision carried weight. What the texts do not reveal is what consequences, if any, followed, and possibility is not evidence. The book of Acts does not solve the mystery either. It follows the Christian community in Jerusalem through a period marked by conflict, arrests, and persecution, but Joseph is never mentioned. He could have remained in the city. He could have left for another region. He may no longer have been present when some of those events occurred. Without a direct reference, we cannot insert Joseph into that history, simply because one possibility seems plausible. The same applies to two dramatic endings often associated with figures from early Christianity, exile and martyrdom. We do not have sufficiently early evidence to claim that Joseph spent his final years as a missionary somewhere else, nor do we possess a reliable contemporary account showing that he was killed because of his connection with Jesus. Later Christian traditions would offer different answers, but none of them can simply be selected as the most likely historical version. So perhaps the most important conclusion is also the least spectacular. Where the sources end, our certainty must end with them. We can study the traditions, determine when they appeared, and understand why Joseph gradually acquired a more elaborate biography. What we cannot do is turn those traditions into established events, and that does not diminish his legacy. Joseph did not need to cross continents, carry the Holy Grail, or die as a martyr to occupy an extraordinary place in the Christian narrative. All four Gospels preserve his name in connection with the burial of Jesus. He appears after the crucifixion has already ended, takes courage, asks Pilate for the body, and participates in the burial that immediately precedes the discovery of the empty tomb. Perhaps that contrast is exactly why so many stories appeared later. Joseph enters the narrative at a decisive moment, performs an action that would be remembered for centuries, and then disappears. The silence left by the earlier sources created a space that later generations tried to fill with imprisonment, miracles, journeys, and sacred relics. But once those later layers are removed, the Joseph we can actually reach through the earlier sources is much simpler, and perhaps even more compelling. The part of his life we can truly document lasts only a few hours. and those few hours were enough for the name Joseph of Arimathea to endure for nearly 2,000 years. After following Joseph of Arimathea from the Gospel accounts into the traditions that emerged centuries later, we arrive at an answer far less spectacular than the legends, but far more secure historically. We do not know where Joseph spent his final years, whether he remained in Jerusalem, whether he continued as a member of the council, or what consequences he may have faced after the burial. We do not know when, where, or how he died. The earliest sources simply do not preserve those answers. What they do preserve is a remarkably brief window into his life. Jesus was dead, the Sabbath was approaching, and Joseph took courage, went to Pilate, and asked for the body. He participated in the burial. John places Nicodemus alongside him in preparing the body. The women saw where Jesus was laid, and the stone closed the tomb. Then Joseph disappears. Centuries later, that silence would be filled with stories of imprisonment, miraculous deliverance, journeys to Britain, Glastonbury, and eventually the Holy Grail. Those traditions are part of the history of how Joseph was remembered, but they cannot be treated as a verified continuation of his life, and perhaps he does not need them. His legacy had already been established long before those stories appeared. All four Gospels preserve his name in connection with the burial of Jesus. A man described as wealthy, respected, a member of the council, and a secret disciple steps forward at the very moment when remaining hidden is no longer enough. We do not know exactly what that decision cost him. We only know that he took courage and acted. By the way, if documentaries like this help you understand the Bible more clearly within its historical sequence, we created the ebook The Bible in Chronological Order. It is a visual guide designed to help you follow events, people, kings, prophets, and empires across a clearer timeline, from Genesis to Revelation. And when you get your copy, you also help our team continue producing investigations like this one. The official link is pinned in the first comment. In the end, perhaps the real mystery of Joseph of Arimathea is not the Holy Grail, Glastonbury, or some lost account of his final years. It is the contrast between the importance of what he did and the silence that followed. The part of Joseph's life preserved by our earlier sources lasts only a few hours between a cross and a tomb. Then Joseph disappears from the narrative. But what he did that Friday was enough for his name to endure for nearly 2,000 years.